the current state that we're in, the realities of Canada and the laws that we have in place and the provinces and municipalities, like all of those were established over time. And they were only established because Canada was able to like secure itself as a country through colonialism. And so these systems are replicating and they reinforce themselves. They require the oppression, the silence. They require the kind of social upheaval that Indigenous communities experience in order to maintain themselves. So the more violence there is in Indigenous communities, the less we're able to organize, the more our voices are silenced, the more stable Canada as a country is, and the easier it is for them to exploit resources and to gain wealth and settler prosperity off of the backs of Indigenous suffering. And so the more that this happens, the more that we push back against that kind of colonial violence. There's not really been fair processes for communities to actually say no to unwanted development, to engage in fair processes. A lot of the current state of laws and policies um, exist as they are because there's been so much intergenerational trauma inflicted on Indigenous people. So Canada is able to maintain itself now through things like the Planning Act, the Places to Grow Act, the Constitution that divides powers between provinces and the federal government. Like those legal structures that are in place are able to exist because there's been so much trauma and harm done. So the way that we encounter colonialism today might not seem like it has been in the past. We're not at war. There's not the same kinds of direct conflict until you get to places where land rights are at issue and Indigenous peoples and First Nations people, Haudenosaunee people are seeing that there's unfair processes. Municipalities that are on the edges of the reserve are doing things like approving developments that aren't aligned with like historic agreements made to the nation by the crown. And so when communities are exhausting these processes, they're not able to exert their land stewardship, and things happen like Gunestado or 1492 Landback Lane, or in other territories like Wet'suwet'en territory where Gitterdam checkpoint right now is happening, or in Kitaganzibi in Algonquin Barrier Lake with the Moose Moratorium. You see Indigenous people placing themselves directly in the line of resource extraction or any extraction of animals in the moose harvest, or unwanted settlement with like turning farmlands or wooded areas into housing developments. And so what we're particularly concerned about with Protect the Tract is the Haldimand Tract. And so for people who aren't familiar with kind of the history that happened around, when the Haldimand Proclamation was made, was that it was following the American Revolution, and some of the Haudenosaunee were allied to the British Crown in the war. And so after the war was fought, George Washington and another one of his generals named Sullivan launched what's called the Sullivan Campaign, and they essentially marched 5,000 soldiers through Haudenosaunee territory in New York State, particularly against the Mohawk Nation, my nation, and forcibly removed us from our territories. They burned down our orchards, our homes, our villages, and they forced us to flee. And our communities fled into what's now known as Canada. They were in a British fort. And so we lost our homelands as a result of our allyship to the crown. And so this tract of land was set aside for the prosperity of the Haudenosaunee people, both as recognition for our allyship and the relationship that we had with the crown, but an acknowledgement of the sacrifice that was made in losing our homelands in the Mohawk Valley, where there's not really been Mohawk people able to return and live there since. And so over time, by the time our community was actually able to establish a community in Grand River, there was already unwanted settlement that was happening along the tract. And you see this, if you review the history, you can see this kind of advocacy the Confederacy was making at the time to have these people that shouldn't have settled in the territory removed. And over time, there was a degradation of that relationship. There was exploitation of the resources of the Haudenosaunee by the crown. in, I believe it was the early 1800s, around 1830, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had around $12 million in a trust by the federal government. And by the late 1870s, almost 40% of that fund was depleted and misspent by the trustees that were put in place by the Crown to manage it. It was used to build Highway 6. It was used to build Osgoode Hall, early universities, early city halls, the Grand River Navigation Company, and it was used to build the Welland Canal. And so, money was misspent that belonged to the community. It was never returned. And then after successfully advocating for a review of these misspent funds, it took until 1922 for the Confederacy to get the Crown to agree to do an inquiry into the misspent funds. And by 1924, before the inquiry could start, the RCMP came in and forcibly removed the Confederacy from jurisdiction in the community and installed a band council system. And so now we're almost 100 years out from that, and we still don't see, full recognition of the inherent governance structure of the community. And there's still this kind of imposed conflict that impacts our community. Also, UNDRIP has Article 18, which is around Indigenous people being able to be represented by the bodies of their choosing. And so this gets applied in different ways, but I think it's really important to remember that there are hereditary governance structures that still exist that are completely displaced by Indian Act band councils, which are empowered by Canada through the Constitution and imposed on communities, that are based on a reserve system and not these broader concepts of territories that extend beyond reserve boundaries. I actually had the privilege to go to the United Nations for the last periodic review of Canada, which happened in 2018. Every 8 years, states are evaluated by the UN for the Committee on Eradicating Racial Discrimination. And there was a conversation that happened in the room that was really important because they talked about veto and whether Indigenous nations have a right to veto development projects. And the thing is, when you have consent, when you have conversations and systems that are based on consent, then you either get consent or you don't. There's no after the fact veto when you have a consenting relationship. And so that's really important, right? It's talking about, there's no need in UNDRIP for there to be a veto because it's based on consent, and that's a different kind of conversation. And so there needs to be that fundamental rethinking about what does that look like. There's also an issue with the Constitution and other laws that I want to touch on. So if we think of like all of the laws in Canada as being a web, so we have the Constitution and how it's connected to the provinces and how provincial law is connected to municipalities. There are Supreme Court rulings around rights and representation in Aboriginal title that are embedded in the Constitution that don't necessarily funnel its way down to municipal zoning and planning act and city plans and that kind of thing. And so this web of laws has these gaps in it where Indigenous rights fall through and we don't see them upheld. So we don't necessarily see municipalities have the ability to adapt to recent Supreme Court decisions and actually enact these principles of reconciliation and Indigenous rights that are necessary and as urgent as Indigenous communities need them to be.